So for a while, it will look like I'm not actually talking about democracy. But much later, you will see that the whole time I've been talking about democracy. So in 1995, Ed Hutchins produced his seminal book, Cognition in the Wild. It was an ethnographic study of a crew navigating a ship. And what he argued, and why it became so important, was that there's no single person responsible for navigating a ship. Instead, all of the people and all of the equipment self-organize into a dynamical system that is actually responsible for steering the ship. Now, this launched the study of what's known as distributed cognition, or extended mind. And that notion of extension comes from what's called 4E cognitive science. This is the cognitive science that I practice. I'm biased, of course, but I happen to think it's cutting edge, and it is very much a dominant subfield of cognitive science. What are the 4Es? The proposals are that cognition is inherently embodied, that having a body is not just happenstance, but actually necessary and constitutive of cognition. Cognition is embedded, it is dynamically coupled to its environment. It's enacted, it's something we do through modifying our sensory motor engagement with the world, and it's extended. Most of our thinking is actually done collectively, not individually. Most of our problem solving is done by networking together. So for example, none of us built this building, none of us are running the electric grid, and none of us here made this microphone, this equipment, the technology, all of this, none of us invented the language that I'm using right now. All of it is collectively run by networking human beings. So if you think of the tremendous power that we've released by networking computers together in things like the internet, and you get the power of distributed computation. A long time before that, culture was networking people together to release the power of distributed cognition. Now, in the cultural intelligence hypothesis by Hermans and others, his papers in 2007 and 2010 are most instructive. They make the proposal that our adaptive trait is to have states of mind, skills, and sensibilities for interfacing. And I want to pause on that word, interfacing. Notice how that is actually a social interaction word, interfacing, face to face. Interfacing with the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. Hannes et al. In 2001 did some very interesting work. So I'm going to describe a task to you. All right, there is a cylinder in it, and it is bolted, so you can't turn it upside or down. And you put a peanut in it, and the peanut will fit down, but the cylinder is too small in diameter, you can't put your hands into it. And they give this problem to a chimp. And I watched a video of it. And the chimp comes up and looks at the cylinder. There's a peanut there, and it wants the peanut, and then it goes away. And I thought, yeah, I'd go away too. Like, I don't know what to do. The chimp appears to be getting a drink of water, and then it brings the water back in its mouth and spits it into the cylinder and floats the peanut to the top and gets the peanut. Most 4-year-old human beings could not do that. They could not solve that task. That's impressive. Chernak and others in 2020 gave very convincing evidence that chimps outperform human beings on working memory tasks. Working memory is that capacity where you can hold things in mind. So if I was to say to you, what's 24 times 25, and you were doing it in your head, that's working memory. Now what we know is working memory is highly correlated with measures of general intelligence. So the greater your working memory, the greater your general intelligence. Chimps outperform us reliably on measures of working memory. Are they more intelligent than us? Well, not if interfacing is part of intelligence. This is the main thesis. It's not that we're individually much smarter, it's that we have an intelligence that is especially designed by evolution to have us interface with the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. Now notice immediately the consequences of that. We have to give up the Lockean individualism that has been associated with thinking about democracy since John Locke. But that doesn't mean, of course, that I'm proposing collectivism, but we have to take note of the fact of collective intelligence and distributed cognition being our primary way in which we solve problems in the world. Mercer and Spurrier, in 2017, in their book, The Enigma of Reason, draw together a whole bunch of evidence to show that human beings reason much better in groups than they do as individuals. So you give the brightest and the best something like the Wason selection task, and Wason started this experimental task in 1966. I won't go over it. The point is, it's a very simple reasoning task, should be relatively easy to get it correct, but reliably since 1966, you get only about 10% of people succeed in the Wason selection task. They get it correct. Instead, they're doing basic conditional reasoning, and they show things like confirmation bias, etc. They tend to only look for evidence that confirms a hypothesis. They don't look for disconfirmation, all kinds of errors. Now, these are the best psychology students at some of the best universities in the world. Those are the participants in the experiments, and they reliably fail it. I predict that if I gave it to you, you would fail it. And that's not an insult. Now, what's interesting is if you put them into groups of 4 and let them talk to each other, the success rate goes from 10% reliably up to 80%. 80%. That's a huge increase. So the empirical evidence for the power of the collective intelligence of distributed cognition, I think, is very clear. But we now have recently the mathematical work of Hole et al. In 2003 and Varley and Hole in 2021, giving a rigorous mathematical modeling and proof that gestalts have causal powers greater than the sum of their parts. So what we have here is a convergence of a lot of empirical evidence and some very rigorous mathematical proof that there is a reality and power to the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. Now, recently, Dan Chiappi and myself, we've published 3 papers, 2 in 2021 and 1 this year, and we were investigating how the NASA scientists move around the robotic rovers on Mars. And we also argued that there's no one individual who is responsible for this. They form a dynamical system with the robot for actually undertaking the science. We then argued that it was a very clear case of what is coming to be known as we agency, that the dynamical system forms an agent that is above and beyond the individual agencies of the individuals and the technology involved. Very much like Hutchinson was arguing way back in '95, but we were able to make this more clear because of all the work that's been done in 4E cognitive science on the notion of we agency. So it's not just that there is a self-organizing system of collective intelligence running on distributed cognition. It can solve problems and it can direct itself. Now, before you think I'm going a little crazy about this, nobody claims that that agent has consciousness or subjective awareness. In fact, sometimes it's referred to as a zombie agent, precisely because it doesn't have that collective, it doesn't have that individual subjective consciousness. But what we're able to clearly argue is we see an emergent agency directing the emergent collective intelligence. An emergent agency, the we agency, directing the emergent collective intelligence. Now that creates an agent that can deal with objects larger than the typical scope of human perception and cognition. So you can deal, the NASA scientists are trying to deal with a very large complex environment, the Martian environment, and they need that hyper agent in order to do it. You need lots of computers, lots of people doing different tasks, you need lots of discussion groups, you need engineers moving the robots and scientists proposing where they should be moved, you need people who are looking at the black and white photos and turning them into 3 dimensions, largely through the use of human imagination. In fact, Dan and I proposed that we agency is how we have to deal with hyperobjects. This is a notion drawn from Thomas Morton in his book, Hyperobject. Hyperobjects don't have a specific temporal spatial location. They're not like physical objects. And of course, we evolved individually to deal with physically manipulable objects. But when you deal with something like global warming, there isn't a place where you can point to where it is. It's everywhere and nowhere. It takes groups of scientists and computers all around the world interacting in order to grasp this hyperobject. Many of the problems that we're facing now, and that's why I mentioned global warming, are hyperobjects. And therefore we proposed that what we need is a clearer understanding of the we agency that can deal with hyperobjects. In fact, we propose that we agency is a kind of hyper agent that can deal with hyperobjects. But what is this intelligence that I'm talking about, and how is it related to agency? So the discussion of what an agent is a very hot topic right now, so I'm not going to give you a comprehensive definition, but I'm going to propose a central criterion. An agent is any being that can detect the consequences of its behavior and modify that behavior in order to achieve its goals. Another way of putting it is that an agent is a problem solver. Intelligence is the capacity to be a general problem solver. You can solve a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains. You can attend this conference, you can play tennis, you can swim, you can play chess, you can carry on a conversation about Australian politics. We have no machine that is remotely close to being able to do anything like that. We have machines that slightly generalize between different types of well-defined games. We are still far away from that. We know that you have a general ability. It's called general intelligence measured by G, and I've been arguing for quite a while, since 2009, that this central ability is a capacity for recursive relevance realization. You face a problem, in fact, it's a meta problem whenever you're trying to do any problem solving. This is the following problem. The amount of information available to you is combinatorially explosive. It is vast, it is overwhelming. The amount of things you could pay attention to in this room, you could look at that spot right there, or that spot, or the relationship between the spots. You can do that. You're capable of it. When you think about it carefully now, the amount of ways you could look at this room and attend to it is combinatorially explosive. It is vast. The amount of information you have in your long-term memory and the possible combinations, it's huge. You could think of an aardvark. You could think of the Aztec Empire. You could think of the beginning of the gold standard. And you could possibly even connect them all together. Think of all the ways you can connect all the things in your long-term memory. All the sequences of actions. I'm going to solve a problem. I'm going to start moving my body around. I could move this finger, then this finger. I could move these two. I could grab. I could lift my hands. I can sing. Out of all the possible combinations, you somehow zero in on the right thing to do, the right thing to pay attention to, and the right things to be remembering right now. You zero in on the relevant information and you ignore most, overwhelmingly most of the irrelevant information. You frame your cognition and you pay attention only to what's within that frame and you ignore what's outside of that frame. It sounds paradoxical, but this is the case. You're intelligent because of your capacity to ignore so much information, which sounds counterintuitive, but this is in fact the central ability that is lacking right now as we attempt to get at artificial general intelligence. As we try to make artificial general intelligence, this ability to zero in on relevant information is turning out to be the key thing. I have similar arguments. I won't review them. They're in video and they're also in print, published, about how the problem of relevance realization is central to categorization, it's central to communication, etc. So, if you take a look at some of my work, Vervaeke et al. 2012, 2013, Hovhannissian and Vervaeke 2022, Anderson, Miller, and Vervaeke 2022, we've proposed a general solution to this relevance realization. Part of it involves predictive processing, and I won't go into that in detail. If anybody wants to talk to me about it, I can. Instead, I want to concentrate on the relevance realization aspect. So how do you do it? Well, there's a lot of technicality in math, but let me give you a general idea. Paying attention right now. How are you doing it? You're sort of doing it, but you're also sort of participating in it, because to a large degree it's self-organizing, because you pay attention to what's obvious to you. But what's actually happening is you have two networks, the task focus network in your brain and the default mode network. And what's happening right now, possibly, I hope not too much, is the default mode network is making you mind wander. Your attention's going to other things. And then the task focus network kills off most of those options and brings you back, your attention to the talk. But you might have kept a couple of the things you were thinking about, because they actually help you understand the talk better. And then wander away, focus back. Wander away, focus back. Now, if you'll note, that's exactly the same structure of biological evolution. Biological evolution, you have a process that introduces variation, processes, I should say, and then you have natural selection that winnows them down, and then from that, it reproduces. This is the self-organizing cycle. You get a new morphology, variation, selection, in a reproductive self-organizing cycle. That's exactly what your attention does. It just does it massively faster than biological evolution. You're doing it right now. You're evolving your attentional, cognitive fittedness to the environment. You're working towards getting what Merleau-Ponty called an optimal grip on the world. So what does that mean? Well, if I want to look at an object, what stance, how do I orient towards it? If I want to read my phone, this might be too bad unless I forgot my glasses. Now, if I want to use my phone as a weapon, I want to maybe orient it closer this way. I might want to look at some detailed thing and I have to bring it close up. Now, the thing is, these are all trade-off relationships. If I'm holding it like this, I can't see it at a distance. If I'm holding it this, I can't. If I'm doing this, I can't hold it like this or see it close up. What you're constantly doing is you're trading between these opposing goals, because as you get one, you lose the other. Now, pay attention to what I just said about attention. Attention is doing what's called opponent processing. You have one process that's working towards one goal, open up your awareness, open up your attention, an opposing process that's winnowing it down, and they are dynamically coupled together, so they evolve your attention. As you do the opponent processing and trade off between all these options, you evolve your sensory motor until you get to the best fit for the problem at hand. That is your optimal grip. That is your optimal grip. You're doing that all the time. You're doing it right now. Now, you also do something very interesting. So, I'm a martial artist, and so I do sparring and fighting. And one of the things you do is you take a fighting stance. You don't actually use that stance for anything. Why do you take that stance? What's the point of that? The point of that stance is it's very optimal. It's sort of optimally placed between all the individual things I need to do. So this is a way of breaking through. This is a way of blocking and punching. I have all these different moves. Each one gives me a specific optimal grip, and the stance puts me in the best place to get to any one of those that I need to get to. My stance is my meta-optimal grip. It's my overall orientation for fighting that puts me in the best place for getting to the various particular moves I need to make. So in addition to any particular optimal grip you're doing on a particular task, your brain and your consciousness is giving you a meta-optimal grip. This is what Stegmaier in his book calls orientation. And what is orientation? You have a fundamental orientation. You have an orientation to this room. You have an orientation to this talk. You have an orientation to this symposium. It's a general stance. And it fits within your general orientation of being in the Czech Republic in the 21st century. And all of that's at work. So you have recursive levels of relevance realization constantly at work. From your orientation at your meta-optimal grip, down to your specific optimal grip for a specific task. And your brain is doing all of that right now because you wouldn't be here if you weren't in the Czech Republic at this time attending this institute. But you wouldn't be following the talk unless you could specifically direct your listening and your looking to follow what I'm saying. All of it, nested together, dynamically, recursive. So, what's constantly happening in your brain is this process of evolving your fittedness is constantly trading, the trade-off relationships, between integrating information and differentiating it. So a system is complex if it simultaneously is integrated and differentiated. My hand is highly differentiated, but it's highly integrated. When something is both highly integrated and highly differentiated, it can do many different things without falling apart. So complexification enhances agency. It gives you your emergent abilities. So, you have your cognitive orientation. It's giving you your basic navigation in this situation. Back to navigating the ship. It's giving you your basic navigation in this situation. You're evolving at many levels your sensory motor fittedness to the world, and you're constantly complexifying your cognition in order to track and couple to the complexity of the world. This talk is fairly complex. You're switching back and forth very rapidly in your brain. We can measure it. It's called metastability, between integrating information and differentiating it. Differentiating it to evolve it, and integrating it to evolve it. Variation, selection. Differentiation varies, integration selects. So, we know that this process is capable of massive self-correction. Sometimes you realize the way you've been framing something is making you pay attention to the wrong things, making you regard the wrong things as relevant. You may say something like, "Oh, I thought she was angry, but she's actually afraid. I've been paying attention to the wrong things. I hadn't noticed what I need to pay attention to." When you have that aha moment, that's a moment of insight. That's a moment of emergence, of new way of fitting yourself to the world. You break an inappropriate frame, you break it up. Oh, I shouldn't be looking at her this way. And you reorient, I should be looking at her that way. Frame breaking and frame making show up in insight, and insight is an instance of a powerful speeding up of the process of the cognitive evolution of your fittedness to the world. Now, what we know, unfortunately, as true, is that that intelligence, while so impressive, is only very weakly predictive of rationality. You take all the standard measures for intelligence, they all strongly predict each other. You take standard measures for rationality, this is the work of Stanovich and others, they all strongly predict each other. So two strong positive manifolds, but the measure for general intelligence and the measure for general rationality are only correlated at 0.3. Intelligence is necessary, but nowhere near sufficient for rationality. Why is that? Because think about what I said. You're intelligent by ignoring most of the information. Remember my example of your interaction with the woman. Sometimes the information you ignore is exactly the information you need to solve your problem. You realize that in a moment of insight, but the opposite is also constantly possible for you. You don't realize that you've misframed the situation. You're finding the wrong things salient, and therefore you're judging the wrong things to be relevant or important. And we live in a world that is exacerbating that. Harry Frankfurt called that bullshit. And I don't mean to be offensive, that's the term of his famous essay. The liar cares about your concern for the truth and tells you something and tries to get you to believe it to be true because of your commitment to the truth. The bullshit artist does something different. They try to make something salient to you and have you not care about whether it's true or false. All advertising works this way. You watch some advertisement about shampoo, and there's beautiful, gorgeous people who are all obviously genetically perfect, experiencing nothing but happiness as they wash their hair with this shampoo. You know it's not true. Like, if you believe that's true, you're insane. You know it's not true. Why do they do it, though? Because you buy the product. Because salience, how things are relevant and obvious to you, catches your attention and directs your behavior. That kind of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior is a perennial, permanent threat to your cognition. You are always susceptible to that foolishness. Which means we need processes that help to ameliorate it. You can't shut off relevance realization or you're doomed. So you need something that can increase the amount of insight you have, your cognitive flexibility, your ability to readapt, to refit yourself to situations. Now, what's very powerful about this is that across time, history, culture, environment, you see people coming up with sets of practices for ameliorating that self-deception and enhancing that cognitive fittedness. The name that's most usually used for those practices is wisdom. See, knowledge deals with ignorance, but wisdom deals with foolishness. And those are not the same thing. You can be very intelligent and very foolish, and there is no contradiction there at all. Now, what's interesting is I participated in the Wisdom Consensus paper from 2020 led by Igor Grossman, and we got basically all of the wisdom researchers in the world, either physically or virtually, into one room, and we hung out for a weekend and we bashed out a consensus paper about what we think are the important features in wisdom. The dominant feature is perspectival metacognition. What does that mean? This is the ability to take multiple perspectives, to be able to shift perspectives. Shifting perspectives is one of the most powerful ways. I'm using my glasses like my mental frame to get out of my mental framing. When I'm in a perspective, what I typically can't see is the way the perspective is biasing me. I can't also take on interests and goals that are outside my perspective. But if I can take on his perspective or his perspective, that I can then look through them back on my perspective, I can actually overcome misframing. We depend on the dialogue between us to generate the multi-perspectival ability that can enhance the collective intelligence towards collective wisdom. And perhaps you're seeing in some ways how I'm now starting to talk about democracy. Okay. So you have cognitive orientation, you have opponent processing, and you have perspectival metacognition, being able to take multiple perspectives, all mutually interwoven together. Now, we started with Plato's navigation of a ship. Sorry, we started with Hutchins' navigation of a ship, but I want to turn to Plato's famous metaphor of the navigation of the ship of state. How do we navigate that ship, which is itself a hyper agent in a world of hyper objects? How do we do this? I want to make note of an idea from Plato that Drew Hyland makes really clear in his really excellent book, Finitude and Transcendence. Plato's whole philosophy is designed to try to get you into a deep remembering, not just knowing the fact, like the world is round, but the deep remembering, like where you're engaged in it and making use of it. The deep remembering of finite transcendence, that we are finite beings. We are not gods. We are finite. We are bound to circumstance and fate in powerful ways. And if we forget that, we will fall into hubris. And so we have in the Greek tradition myths about hubris. Icarus as a classic example. These myths of hubris are designed to remind us that we are finite. But what was Icarus doing? Icarus was flying, transcending. But if we get too caught up in our transcendence, we will fall because we're finite. But of course, if we just give into our finitude, then we will be subject to despair and servitude. We also have to acknowledge our capacity for transcendence. And so we have hero myths. The hero myths are designed to remind us, encourage us, enable us to engage in transcendence, to break the frame we're in, leave home like Luke Skywalker, go out, introduce variation, and then select the task that needs to be done, and then bring it back. Do you see the relevance realization machinery at work there? And you've got the opponent processing between the myths of hubris and the myths of heroism, and they're constantly keeping us remembering, if we pay attention to them, and of course we don't anymore. If we pay attention to them, they give us the opponent processing that gives us the meta-optimal grip on our humanity, that we are finite transcendence through and through. You can see the myths as enacting relevance realization on the collective intelligence of distributed cognition, trying to educate us into wisdom. Brett Anderson, my co-author on a recent paper, has actually proposed this argument in a recent publication. Now, of course, like all intelligence, the collective intelligence of distributed cognition is capable of foolishness. I'm proposing to you that we should understand democracy as opponent processing within the collective intelligence of distributed cognition that is trying to self-organize that collective intelligence into a more proper orientation to the world by having us deeply remember and enact our humanity, our finite transcendence. But there are ways in which the collective intelligence can be subject to self-organizing foolishness. The bullshit can overwhelm us. And are we not now in a world in which the bullshit is overwhelming us more and more and more? How can the opponent processing of democracy degenerate? Well, it can break down into polarization in which the emphasis on differentiation overtakes the opponent processing. Or it can break down in groupthink, in echo chambers and bubbles that overemphasize the integration. We lose the complexification that allows us to deal with the complexity of the world, and we stupefy ourselves into a kind of collective foolishness. When you have polarization, the opponent processing breaks down into adversarial processing. One side is trying to destroy at all costs the other. And the problem with this, of course, is that debate depends on shared orientation. If we do not have a shared normativity, we can't engage in debate. Groupthink also destroys the opponent processing because it reduces the multi-perspectival nature that is needed for collective wisdom. We're all thinking from the same perspective. We all have the same orientation. So either we don't have any orientation or we all have exactly the same one, and the whole machinery breaks down. Now, Dewey had hoped, John Dewey, that the dynamical system of science, which is also collective intelligence running on distributed cognition, would save democracy. That dynamical system of science and the dynamical system of democracy, the two forms of collective intelligence, would also correct each other. The problem is that both science and democracy right now tend to focus on the propositional level. We emphasize only propositional knowing. Propositional knowing is knowing that something is the case. It gives you beliefs, and it's stored in your semantic memory. Your semantic memory is your knowledge of facts, like cats are mammals. There's no event associated with that, you just remember it. Now the problem with that, and this is my work with Dan on the rovers and a lot of 4E cognitive sciences, that's not your only or primary form of knowledge. Your beliefs are not the primary thing directing your behavior in that sense. If we mean by belief, the capacity to assert a proposition. A lot of your ability to navigate the world is actually based on knowing how to do things, not knowing that, but knowing how to do things, knowing how to walk around, knowing how to kiss somebody you love. This is called your procedural knowledge, and it gives you skills, and it's stored in a different kind of memory called procedural memory. You have another kind of memory, perspectival memory. It's your memory of episodes. It's called, like, you can't remember where you learned that 2 + 2 = 4, but I bet you might remember your last birthday. You can call up your perspective on a situation, what it was like to be you in that situation there and then. That's perspectival knowing, and that's about being present and properly connected. And it ultimately depends on your participatory knowing, the way physics and evolution has shaped you and the world so you fit together. Culture, evolution, gravity has shaped this floor so I can walk on it with my bipedalism. We fit together. It gives us our primary fittedness. Now, what's the point of all this? Why are you telling me about all these kinds of knowing other than propositional? Our culture's fixated on the propositional, on beliefs. We're in propositional tyranny. But here's what the research is showing. Most of the sense of meaning in life comes from the non-propositional kinds of knowing, because they are the ones that are properly connecting you, giving you that cognitive fittedness. The propositional sits on top, like the icing on the cognitive cake. All the non-propositional is where the meaning is to be made. Think about what happens in an insight. You can't even put into words what's happening in an insight. But in that insight, you connect. It's bright to you. You're alive. You're connected to the situation. Insofar as we have lost touch with the non-propositional knowing, and this is something Plato argued, we have lost touch with the machinery of meaning. Insofar as democracy also sees itself just within the framing of propositional tyranny, it will be unable to afford people the education of collective intelligence into collective wisdom that enhances our religio. I use that term deliberately. Our sense of religio means to bind, our connectedness. But of course, it's the etymological origin of religion, a sense of importance, of value, of realness. I've been arguing, and I won't return to all of those arguments because my lecture series was 50 hours long, so I'd need 50 hours right now, and that would probably kill most of you. So I've been arguing at length that the West, whatever that is supposed to point to ultimately, is suffering from a meaning crisis, or another way of understanding it is a wisdom famine. I will ask my students, where do you go for information? They hold up their phone. Where do you go for knowledge? The science, the university. Where do you go for wisdom? Deafening silence, deadly silence. If our democracy is not educating us towards wisdom and alleviating the meaning crisis by understanding the embodied, enacted, embedded, extended nature of our cognition, it will not survive, because the meaning crisis, the wisdom famine, will overwhelm it. Debate presupposes a common unity, a community. It presupposes distributed cognition running collective intelligence that's being educated towards the wisdom of enhancing our connectedness, our meaning in the world. Without that, what we have is degenerate adversarial processing or echo chambering that is not addressing, but in fact exacerbating the meaning crisis and the wisdom famine within propositional tyranny. So all we have is endemic, endless ideological warfare. And the tsunami of bullshit that it generates. What is needed is a way of accessing collective intelligence and transforming it into collective wisdom. I've been engaged in a project now for a few years of trying to go back to the Platonic origin. And we have, again, a lot of research, Gonzalez and Hyland and Kirkland and a whole host of others, that the point of the Socratic process of dialogue, I prefer the Greek word dialogos because we've degenerated the English word dialogue, that the process of dialogos is exactly what we should be paying attention to. It focuses on non-propositional knowing. In a dialogue, Socrates comes in and interacts with you, and there's an attempt to come up with a propositional solution to the nature of virtue. Virtue is your orientation, it's your meta-optimal grip that helps fit you to a particular situation. Any particular virtue is a way of being wise in that situation. To be wise here is to be kind, to be wise there is to be courageous. But what happens is the attempt to come up with the definition fails. You get massive frame breaking. It's called aporia. And everybody goes, I don't know what courage is. But in the dialogue in which that is taking place, the generals who are arguing with Socrates, I don't know what courage is, but what do they do when the dialogue ends? They have their sons live with Socrates because Socrates was able to exemplify in his procedural, perspectival, participatory knowing what courage is. So you've got a massive frame breaking and a massive frame making taking place. And I'm participating in a lot of these emerging communities. People get together, they're circling, authentic relator, inquiry, Buddhist dialogue, all of these springing up all over the world. And I go to them and I participate in, and people are trying to move out of merely discussing, even debating, and they're trying to move into dialogos. They're trying to get a collective flow state where they are trying to help each other break frame and make frame, and you get this collective emergence of new ways of seeing and being in the world. You get the emergence of what is called the we space, and I've participated in it, and it's powerful. And what's really amazing is the religio there, because you get people from all different backgrounds, mostly secular, but they'll talk about this sense of participating in the we space in religious terms, because that's the best thing they have for, they say, this is a new kind of intimacy. This isn't sexual or friendship, but I feel so connected to myself. Listen to the language. So connected to myself, to other people, to the world. Religio, meaning, and intelligibility. I'm getting to a place in my thinking that I couldn't possibly get to on my own. We are all co-emerging on new ways of seeing and being that connect us deeply to the world. This is enhanced mindfulness, enhanced metacognition. Doing this, I'm participating, I'm studying it. It's all over the place, and it's growing. Doing and trying to get work published on this very soon, by the way. Got a new video series coming out called After Socrates that is the exploration of all of this. Recently, I went to a conference in Vermont where we were getting many of the leaders of many of these emerging communities together. Explicitly, we committed ourselves to engaging in dialogos, not debate or discussion, but dialogos. And there are practices for getting into this in order to try and create a community of these communities and create an alternative viable subculture to the predominant culture, so we can steal the culture away from the pernicious bullshit and ideological warfare that is corrupting the very possibility of the collective wisdom that democracy could afford. It is happening. It's happening, and it's strongly analogous to the Bildung movement in the Scandinavian countries. The Scandinavian countries were agrarian, authoritarian. They set up basically secular monasteries it started in Denmark, all over the country, and people would go. You can still do this. You can go to the folk high school system, and you can do this kind of dialogos. And the Bildung movement transformed those societies into the democracies they are today. I'm not talking about something impossible. It has happened before, and it is happening right now. And it has been my great privilege to be able to participate in this, to study it, and to help afford it. And it has also been my great privilege to bring this talk to you today. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Vervaeke. We have time for a couple of questions, if that's okay. John, yeah. And I'll just pass the microphone to Professor Vervaeke.
I'll go back to the podium.
I take a slightly different view from you. I'm quite surprised you talk about Plato and democracy in the same breath.
Yes.
Given the fact that he's the first theoretician that's hostile to democracy that we have in the Western tradition. But what I'm really worried about, because I think what you say about cooperation and working together is really quite important. And many of this stuff, for example, if you look at Marx's Capital, he's got a chapter on cooperation where he deals with this stuff and talks about the power of cooperation. But what I'm really worried about in your talk is your conceptualization of agency.
Yes.
Because the way you posit agency is to de-individualize it, to the point at which human subjectivity acquires this Deweyan technocratic form. And it then becomes we're no longer talking about citizens in the democratic sense of the term. What we're talking about are essentially are people whose outlook in the world is influenced and shaped by the world around them to the point at which their individual initiative breaks down. And I think that where you and I would probably be totally disagreeing is on normativity. Because I have a sense that you and I don't share norms. But that doesn't stop you and me from debating. And in fact, the very idea of debate, especially in the contemporary condition, but also historically, presupposes the idea that there isn't shared normativity. If there was shared normativity, there wouldn't be very much to debate about, except the most trivial, technical kind of issues, rather than the substantial issues that really touch upon meaning. And in fact, it's the search, the quest for meaning, that actually historically has required that you and I and people in this room come from very, very different intellectual and moral traditions. And I say this particularly because one of the problems that we confront in our world is a crisis of normativity. Fundamental crisis of normativity in all the Anglo-American, all the Western world. And the only way that that crisis of normativity can be confronted is through the creation and the forging of new norms, or norms that are relevant to us, maybe from the past. And that requires the kind of debate that's very different than the kind of deliberative coming together, I would say a very therapeutic way of sense-making. So yeah, I think that your approach is, I'm sure you're a nice guy, but it's fundamentally anti-democratic in the sense that I understand it, and in the sense that the Greeks, the whole Greek Socratic tradition, Socrates is a great guy, and I teach Socrates, I've written chapters about him, but he was hostile to the people. He really thought that people were just no good, not really reliable agents in a democratic world. And he basically said that what we need are political experts. In other words, he was the first person to articulate a technocratic orientation to the world, where the people are looked upon as individuals that you lecture to, and you bring your rationality to them. So these are my concerns, because as an old school Democrat, it seems to me we need a balance between individual agency, that what's called subjectivity and the exercise of subjectivity, as well as an openness to debate, even against our most hostile opponents. Because unless we do that, then we end up with cancel culture, as we have in the United States, where we say, those people are outside. We're not going to debate with them because we don't have any shared value. And instead of seeing how we can bring them in, we take refuge in the fact that we're superior to these people, these Trumpite idiots who haven't got an idea in their heads. So just a few observations.
So as you prophesied, we do disagree, and this is how I disagree with you. First of all, I did not propose a reduction of subjectivity. I, in fact, repeatedly emphasized multi-perspectival taking, which requires the differentiation of subjectivity. And I proposed it in a processing with the integration that is happening. So I actually put a proper place for subjectivity and made it a central feature for the cultivation of wisdom. About the idea of shared norms in debate, yes, we have shared norms in debate. We're agreeing to use the same language. We're following all the Greissian rules of communicative cooperation. We're following all the stuff that Habermas talked about. We're using a shared sense of reason, a shared authority of logic. We're using a shared sense of proper decorum. I'm not allowed to hit you, and other kinds of things. And far from that being a trivial sense of cooperation, it's actually fundamentally important because it's exactly that level of shared normativity that is being undermined, for example, by a lot of postmodern critique. So I think it's of value to remember the cooperation. I think the problem with debate is not the lack of cooperation. As you say, we can oppose, but we forget that we have to have a joint commitment to the non-propositional aspects. We have to have a joint commitment to the procedures and the methods of perspective taking and the methods of agency formation. To your point about agency, I was explicit that I was not trying to give a comprehensive definition of agency. I was trying to give an important criterion of it, which is the capacity for directing problem solving. This allows us to understand agency in non-human beings, which is a very important thing, I would argue. We have to have a sense of agency that can include non-human organisms. And the proposal of zeroing in on intelligence and problem solving affords us doing that. So we actually get a more inclusive. About Socrates, I disagree with you about Socrates hating the people he was with. He saw himself repeatedly as a midwife helping people give birth to themselves. And he was much more committed. He was, of course, capable of tremendous self-criticism and undermining any argument or proposal he gave. He said, in fact, he wanted to follow the logos like the wind wherever it went. And it was that commitment to following the logos, dialogos, that made what he was doing so powerfully transformative. You argued that we need new norms. Yes, I agree with you. Debate is not going to produce new norms. If it could, it would have. It's not going to. But there are new emerging forms of social communicative interaction that are birthing new norms. And those are the communities I have pointed you to, and I participated in them. And they take into account the non-propositional and how important it is for actually transforming people's sense of connectedness and meaningness. Now, I'm sure we still disagree, but that's my response to your question.
Thank you. I think it's a very good context. I may partially disagree, but maybe not as strongly. But I just wanted to ask one thing. So you mentioned from a social point of view that you don't like individualism. I think this is one of the issues because this country obviously had this collectivism and
I understand,
at some point we turn. So I think the attitude here towards that statement would be slightly different than maybe it is in the West now. But then you also mentioned that collectivism is not the solution.
That's right.
So, and then you turn to the third option, which is this distributed approach.
Yes.
The problem is that this is like that something is going to happen which is outside our control, that is going to bring this distributed thing, and we have to accept it because that's the evolution. Is that basically what you're saying? Because that is not exactly aligned with people that think about freedom and individual freedom would think. Yeah.
So thank you for noting that I was trying to step out of both individualism and collectivism, and I was trying to say that seeing them being locked into that adversarial frame was preventing us from going forward. So thank you for acknowledging that. I'm not proposing that we passively wait for this to happen. I'm proposing between the idea of willful imposition. You can't do it. You can't do that. It's like being friends with somebody. You can't impose it. You can't will it. You can't just passively receive it. You have to participate, deeply participate. You can direct it, you can influence, but you have to be willing to be shaped by it and directed by it. That's how friendship works. And the point is, you do belong to a collective that is neither collectivist nor individualistic, and that's what a culture is. And again, how does culture move? How does culture move forward? Do we just passively receive it? No. Do we individually make it? No. We participate in a process that we can help to educate to make it wiser. So I'm proposing to you a participatory model rather than a making model or a receiving model. And I pointed to you that we already have such a thing. It's called culture. And these cultural processes are the kinds of processes that are capable of generating new norms. And as I mentioned, this has been successfully done in the past with the Bildung movement. No one person creates a norm. It doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. You have to get people to share in it. They have to make it together at some level, or they will not share it. Did you want to follow up? Wait till your mic.
Just very quickly. So, I mean, obviously the internet is an example of this
yes,
distributed
exactly.
approach. And as we know, it kind of converges back to centralization under these big platforms. So if we do this same experiment in the society more broadly, is there not a risk that we get a similar outcome, which means a couple of big kind of interest groups that will be actually sitting and dictating to us whatever they want?
That's exactly right. That's exactly the right example, the internet. Now, why can these large-scale collectives take root? Because of the inherent fragmentation in the internet. Because the way it fragments and creates distractive attention. The economy of the internet is attention, and it runs on bullshit. And because of the pervasiveness of the bullshit, that we are actually fragmented, and we mistake having likes and friends with actually having participatory social connectedness. That is it's not only the individual components of bullshit, it's the orientation towards the internet that is the primary bullshit. It tells us that some, purely propositional marker is the same as social involvement and cultural creation. But that can be challenged. And the thing I've been talking about is happening on the internet. We even have a thing called this little corner of the internet, where the dialogical, the dialogos model of participation and long-form presentation of ideas, like awakening from the meaning type crisis, are taking priority and growing. I was just in a conference last weekend where that community got together. So the internet doesn't have to go the way it is. There's a possibility of reorienting it that can undermine the bullshit and the fragmentation that makes us prey to the centralization forces.